I was driving home from work the other night, and a young man passed me in a pickup truck. He was driving along, and he had his girlfriend with him. At least I assume it was his girlfriend, because they seemed to be sharing the same seatbelt. Now, these pickup trucks have got a seatbelt in the middle so that you can have three people belted in across the front of this one, but she was too far to the left to be in the middle seatbelt, and they were either breaking the law or she was in the same seatbelt with him. And I smiled. I kind of enjoyed watching them go down that way, and I thought about it because I hearkened back to many, many years ago when my dad had bought a 1948 Chevrolet. I was still in high school, and I was dating a young lady named Allie Driver. And I thought back to the number of times and the number of nights that we drove around Houston to the drive-in restaurants over there. They don't have that many of those anymore, but, you know, that's where all the teens hung out in those days. You'd go to the drive-in restaurant. We would drive around Houston, again, sharing the left front seat of my dad's 54 Chevrolet. And those were the years where I learned to drive one-handed. In fact, it was so important that I wanted to get one of these steering knobs, you know, that you could clamp on the steering wheel. That made the whole thing a lot easier to be able to drive along with one hand. And I believe, if memory serves, that Allie learned how to, actually this was a manual shift. Chevy in 1948 I don't think had an automatic. It was manual shift, and she learned how to shift while I clutched. And we worked very, very well together. It was a partnership that got off to a good start, and is still going on and has survived the advent of automatic transmissions very nicely, thank you. But as I watched them pass me and go on to the south, I couldn't help thinking to myself, I wonder how long it will last. It was a kind of a funny feeling as I watched them go on their way. Because in recent months, I have seen so many people that I have known who were in love, who have come to the place to where they hope they never see each other again, where they probably hate this person whom they used to love so much that they would get up right next to them in the car or the pickup as they went down the road, that they would hold the other person's face in their hands and say, you just don't know how much I love you. And now they have come to the place where there probably is no person on the face of this earth so hated as that person they used to love. It was a sad moment. It was a funny feeling, as I say. I watched them go south, and I chuckled over it, and I had my fond memories, and then all of a sudden, this feeling came back. I wonder how long it will last. And I went on from that to wondering, what in the world is the chemistry? What is it that happens that changes people in that way? And I've seen it again, and again, and again. And you can try to tell young people when they're getting married. You can try to warn them about this as a possibility. You can tell them that they are no different from thousands, no, millions, I guess, of other young couples who have got married who learned to hate one another. You can ask them, you can tell them, and you can say that there are things that people do. There are ways that people act. There are ways that people think that make all the difference in the world in how these things finally fall out in the end of it all. But you really can't talk to people. How is it possible? How does it happen? In a word, why do marriages fail? Because so many do. I have watched marriage after marriage fail with a growing sense of helplessness. Because you get the feeling that there is absolutely nothing you could do. Not long ago, I saw it happen again, and I sat and I thought to myself, was there anything I could have said? Was there some sermon that I might have delivered? Was there some personal counsel I might have offered? But you see, the personal counsel I wouldn't have offered because I never suspected. I never would have imagined. It came as a total shock. I was left with my mouth hanging. I had no idea it was coming. So that was out of the question. And then I wondered, well, was there something that I could have said maybe in a sermon that would have made a difference to these people somehow? And the answer came back to me, very chilling answer, probably not. Probably not. Because I have found over time that people don't put the question to themselves. They don't see it in themselves. People don't listen very well anyway. They only get a small percentage of what you say. And as a minister, I have just had this growing feeling that, what's the use? You can tell people, and you can tell them, and you can tell them, and it just doesn't seem to make any difference. And I realized after this line of thought that was running through my mind, that it had been a long, long time since I had taken in hand to preach about marriage and marriage relationship. And I wondered why, what the reason was, why it had been that way with me. And I had to be honest. I had to feel that it was because of this sense of futility. That it seemed that people were bound and determined to go certain directions, and that no matter what kind of advice you give them, it doesn't seem to work. And I thought, and I wondered. In the old days, in the worldwide Church of God, we wouldn't let people split up. There was no divorce in the church. Now, how might that be, you might ask? Well, it's very simple. If they got a divorce, you put them out of the church. Therefore, presto, no divorce in the church. That is, of course, one way of keeping the situation out of the church. I don't know how much good it does to people you throw out, but it's one way of going about it. In those days, the standard sermon on marriage relationship would inevitably find its way to Ephesians, the 5th chapter, and verse 22. This is the verse that says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." Now, in order to keep this in perspective, you must bear in mind that it was always a man who was preaching this. And therefore, it was always preached, as far as I can recall, with a rather heavy bias upon the side of things of the woman's responsibility to submit to her own husband, who was the head of the family, the head of the wife, in everything. Not just in most things, but in everything. I guess preaching this the way we did must have worked because we had no divorce in the church. But what about Ephesians 5:22 and the verses following? There are scriptures in the Bible that have to do with the way marriage is. Let's just take a look. Ephesians 5:22 says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." Now, that in itself is sobering enough, because we all know the way in which we are supposed to be subject to Jesus Christ, do we not? You are not subject to Jesus Christ when it suits you. You are not subject to Jesus Christ when it's comfortable. You are not subject to Jesus Christ merely when you feel like it. You are supposed to be subject to Jesus Christ through thick and thin, for better or for worse, which might sound familiar, no matter what the cost, no matter what the pain. You're warned that for His name's sake you might suffer persecution, and that you're supposed to be subject to Him even if it costs you your life, right? So when Paul comes along and tells women, you've got to be subject to your husbands as unto the Lord, well, that gives one pause. Now, if a woman came to me and said, "Look, I've got a problem. The Scripture poses difficulties for me, because I live with a man who, basically, where I feel my life is in danger. He's beaten me and put me in the hospital twice. And he comes home drunk. And when he's drunk, he's out of his head, and there's no way of knowing what he will do. Does this mean that I have to subject myself to that man as unto the Lord?" Now, of course, as a preacher, you can say, "Well, you've got to learn to trust God. God will take care of it. You've got to pray and have faith, and, Job said, though he slay me, yet I will trust him," talking about God, and therefore you've got to be faithful to your husband, or you've got to be there, and you've got to submit to this brute no matter what he does to you. Is that right? Common sense tells us it is not. You can make a squared-up case, I guess, of some sort of syllogistic logic having to do with how a woman should submit to her husband in that way. But, of course, the verse doesn't stop here. The chapter doesn't stop here. It goes on to say, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and He is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Now, what are we going to do with it? So the man is a brute. So he is dangerous. We still have this scripture to deal with. However, it doesn't stop here either. It goes on to say, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Jesus Christ cared so much for the church that he was willing to die for the church. Now, this does change the complexion of this verse just a little bit, doesn't it? Because what Paul is talking about here with a husband and a wife is talking about the way things ought to be. Where you have a man who cares for his wife like in the same way as, with the same love and the same care that Jesus Christ has for the church. Now, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And a man is his wife's protector and provider and the one who cares for her and loves her. He goes on to say, love your wives like Christ loved the church, that he might, that he gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. Now, I would like to see a man who has been willing to bruise his wife. I would like to see him bruise himself in the same way, perhaps in the same place. I would like for him to be willing to take the same kind of punishment he lays upon his wife. I do not believe there is any excuse ever in our world for a man ever laying a hand on his wife in anger. And a man like that who does so ought to be punished. The Bible in the Old Testament speaks of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And a man who breaks out his wife's tooth ought to have his tooth broken out. In my humble opinion, that's the way it ought to be right now. It is not right for people who are strong to abuse people who are weaker than they are, who are not as strong as they are. It's just not God's way, and it is totally out of context, out of what God would have us do with this, isn't it? The instructions are as plain as ever they would need to be. So a man then is to look after his wife as Christ would look after the church. No man ever yet hated his own flesh. He nourishes it and cherishes it, just like the Lord does the church. Are members of Jesus' body, and of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, in other words, the whole thing he's talking about here is the ideal. That is the relationship between Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see to it that she reverences her husband. Now, when we look at these, and we think about these scriptures, as I said, these scriptures are very difficult for an awful lot of people. Ephesians 5 and further upon people to do things which, quite candidly, most of us know we can't do. We know we can't live up to them. We try, we'd like to, and we read the scriptures and they can make us very unhappy. Why is this so? The problems, the difficulties that people have and the marriages are so far gone that they can't even get to where they talk about these things because the fundamentals are so bad. Marriages fail for a lot of reasons. Marriages fail, for example, because people won't listen to each other. Now, let me put it to you this way. How many people do you know whom you would really call good listeners? This is the type of person, when you are talking to them, it's very clear to you that they are listening to you. They understand what you are saying. This is the kind of person who will ask you a question when you pause for breath, for clarification, and give you a chance to explain still further. This is the kind of person who, when they do speak back to you, what they say is relevant to what you were just saying. Now, there are very, very few good listeners in this world. Are you one of them? Really? Truly? You know, one of the sad things about it, too, is that oftentimes people who will listen well to a coworker or one of the fellows at work or one of the ladies down at the store will not listen to the husband or will not listen to the wife. I wonder why it is. How is it that is it just a matter of taking one another for granted? Have we gotten so used to each other? Now we think it's not important to listen to the wife? Now it's not important to listen to the husband? If I were going to put things up front that I think cause marriages to fail, I'm going to put the failure to listen as number one, because practically everything else falls out of it. You know, there's another funny thing about this question of listening. One of the reasons we don't listen to people we know really well, like a husband or a wife, is because we think we already know. I don't know if you realize this or not, but an enormous amount of the problems that arise between husbands and wives arise because one or the other assumes that they know what the other person is thinking. How many of you are married to a mind reader? Yeah, or maybe you can put it this way, someone who thinks he is a mind reader. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands on this. I mean, we don't want to get anybody in a lot of trouble. Now, it is true that when we live together, we do get to know each other very well. But do you have any idea how much heartache and how much suffering comes because person A decides on the motivations that they're quite sure that the reason why person B made this statement was because of this. And then person B can protest until the cows come home that was not the real way, but their mind is made up. That's exactly why you did it. I know. You can't tell me why that you did it. I know you. I've been living with you 30 years. How can you tell me that you didn't do it for that reason? And so, since I already know, what's the point in listening? What's the point in trying to get inside? Now, not only do we not listen to one another, we won't listen to preachers. No, not really. Oh, you'll hear a few things, and if it suits you, you'll hear it. And you really do hear the things that apply to your wife. People hear the things that apply. You'll be surprised over the years. I've been preaching for a lot of years now. How many times in a sermon, when I have made a point, I see someone go, and the elbow goes out and nudges the other person. Now, of course, what that means is when someone elbows the one sitting next to you, saying, "Boy, he really got me that time. I'm the one that's guilty." That's what we're trying to tell our mate, isn't it? When we nudge him that I really needed that. Sure, it is. I'm afraid not. What we're trying to say is, you needed that, and I'm glad he got you, you rascal. I've been trying to tell you that for years. If you wouldn't listen to me, maybe you'll listen to the preacher. People oftentimes will not listen to counselors, and they won't get counsel. One of the things that I feel that people wait way too long about is to go and seek professional help when marriages get in trouble. You know, it is expensive to get professional counseling, but it is not nearly as expensive as divorce. And it's not nearly as expensive as the pain and the suffering and the loneliness that goes on year after year. Now, a lot of people are concerned about the fact they may go see this counselor who's not a Christian, who's not going to counsel them on Christian principles, but I want you to understand something. The most important thing that marriage counselors do for you is not to tell you what to do. It is to help you find out what you want to do and to help you get a look at yourself, to help you find out what you really want. That's what their biggest chore is. And a lot of times, a third party, an honest broker, a disinterested party can tell you something that your wife has been trying to tell you for years, and you wouldn't listen to her, or vice versa. There are things, aren't they, that you cannot tell your wife or your husband. I don't want to show hands. I don't want to cause any trouble with this sermon. I don't know if I'll be able to help any, but I sure don't want to make things worse. Are there things that you would really like to be able to tell your husband or your wife, and you feel you cannot tell them? Oh, sure there are. If you've been living together 6 months, no. If you've been living together 30 days, you've probably already found things that you really would like to say, but you really feel that if you did say it, it might make things worse. One of the great advantages is that sometimes in a marriage counseling situation, a third party can help get those points across, and you can come to understand. They are a help in listening, because a counselor is trained to listen, knows what to listen for, knows how to feed it back to you, knows how to help you hear it, knows how in many ways to let you hear what you are saying. Surprisingly, an awful lot of us don't even listen to ourselves, our better selves. We don't listen to friends. I'll tell you, though, when people do listen to friends, and this is one of the great tragedies that I've seen in this whole pattern, is of a woman who's having difficulty with her husband. There are problems. They're not necessarily insurmountable problems, but there are difficulties. And her lady friends, her cronies, as it were, are counseling her to get rid of the bum. Throw him out. Leave him. Get away from him. Start a new life. Here she is trying to say, no, I believe in marriage. I'm married for life. I am committed. I made a promise. I'm going to live up to my commitment. And her friends are saying, oh, why don't you get out of that marriage while you can? It's a tragic shame. But if no friends would ever encourage a friend to get a divorce, there probably would be a whole lot fewer divorces in this world. I know of a few. Could tick them off on my fingers as to who they are. And yet, it happens. We'll listen to people when they're encouraging us to do something we probably shouldn't do, when they're encouraging us to make a sacrifice, when they're encouraging us to try a little harder, when they're encouraging us to try to make it work. We don't listen. And probably the most serious problem of all is we don't listen to God. Because people who are out of the habit of listening don't listen to Him either. In fact, the most common single complaint that God levels against mankind, perhaps the most serious complaint of all, is, I have spoken to you and you would not listen. I sent prophets to you and you would not listen to them. I sent my son to you and you killed him. How many times and how many ways has God tried to speak to man, and man wouldn't listen? And here man sits in the 20th century wondering, well, where is God? Why doesn't God say something? Why doesn't God do something? And through the generations of man, when God has spoken, they wouldn't listen. Jesus gave a parable of a rich man and the man named Lazarus who died. And the rich man who is in torment lifts his eyes and sees Lazarus in Abraham's bosom afar off. And after certain requests he's made, he said, look, send Lazarus to my sons, my brothers, lest they come to this place of torment. And Abraham says, look, they had Moses. Let them hear him. And he said, oh no, but if somebody would rise from the dead, they'd listen. His answer, if they won't hear Moses, they wouldn't listen if somebody rose from the dead. But of course you would, wouldn't you? If somebody rose from the dead and came to you and told you that you ought to do something that you already knew you ought to have done, you're really going to listen to them, aren't you? Right now, you think you would. And maybe for a day or two you would. But the point is, the reason why you don't listen to Moses is not because you can't hear him. It's not because you can't understand him. It's not because you can't grasp what he is saying. It's because it infringes on your life and what you want to do, upon your appetites, your desires, the things you like. That's all. That's why you don't listen to Moses. It's why you don't listen to Jesus. It's why you don't listen to your friends. It's why many times you don't listen to the preacher. It's why you don't listen to your husband. It's why you don't listen to your wife. Because they're telling you things you don't want to hear. Why do marriages fail? Because people don't listen. One of my favorite proverbs is Proverbs 18 in verse 2. It says that a fool takes no delight in understanding, but only that his heart may discover itself. In other words, a fool does not delight in coming to a grasp of things, of coming to understand things, of coming to an ability even to explain things. He only takes delight in expressing himself. putting out whatever's on his mind, whatever on his heart. This is the kind of thing you run into again and again, that people just don't try to understand. I did once, at least. I remember a man calling me on the phone and talking to me about a problem that he had. And quite candidly, I had no idea what to tell him. I had no idea what suggestion to make to him. But I did know that one of the things that people in this world are hungry for is understanding. And so I made up my mind, and I did it through that whole conversation. About every time he would pause, as though he wanted me to say something, I would say, I understand. I understand. He would go on for a little while longer, and he would say, I would say, I understand. And I was trying to understand. And whenever there was something I didn't understand, I asked him about it. And he would explain it, and I'd say, I understand. The conversation went on for quite a while, and finally we hung up, and I never gave the man any advice. He called me back months later and told me how much that conversation had meant to him. And, he said the words that I can remember out of the conversation were the words, I understand. It was a lifesaver to it. I didn't give him any advice, but he was able to express himself. He was able to be understood, and somehow or other he came to understand his own problem better because someone else understood what he was saying or was trying to understand and asking questions. If you have trouble focusing your mind and keeping yourself in focus on what someone is trying to tell you, try this little technique. Listen, try to find as you listen something that you can inquire more deeply into. It's that simple. As you listen to someone talking, realize that oftentimes what a person really wants to say, what's really down in their heart, is deeper than what they are presently telling you. As you listen along, listen for something to ask about, something to inquire about. What did your father do for a living? Once they brought up the fact their father used to live up in Alabama. What did your father do? Was he a farmer? And let the thing go for a while. And a person who will seek understanding. Now, you read about all these things about seeking understanding in Proverbs, and you think it means understanding of the meaning of life, understanding of the law of God, understanding of the great issues of the universe. Look, why don't you try, first of all, just understanding one other human being? Because if you can't understand the person you're living with, how in the world do you think you can ever come to understand God? Does it make sense? And maybe it's an exercise in coming to understand God, to understand one creature of His, your husband, your wife. I think it'd be fascinating sometime to do a quiz of married couples to find out how much they really know about one another. I wouldn't know how to design it, but I'm sure somebody will. To find out how much married couples really know about one another. About birthplace, about relatives, about the locations of things, about dates and ages when certain things happen in life, about where you went to school, about did you have a pet? What was the first dog you ever had, or cat? Or did your family have an attitude about, animals? Did you live in the city most of the time? Did you live on a farm? Did you all move a lot? Did your dad own his own home? You do over a period of time pick up a lot of things in your marriage. But it was really surprising how much there is to know that you don't know, and I'll tell you how to find out. Ask. Just ask. And in the process of asking, try to understand the person you're living with. It's the best time you'll ever spend. Marriages also fail because people insist on doing stupid things. Now, I don't just mean sinful things. Sin does jump on us, and people make mistakes, and people, they do wrong oftentimes, not just out of stupidity, but out of weakness. But a lot of marriages go bad because people insist on doing stupid things. Now, the only example of this that really comes to mind at this moment is a man named Jimmy Swaggart. Everybody knows his story by now. And I'm not going to tell you something about Jimmy Swaggart that I think he would not agree with. What Jimmy Swaggart did was sinful. But probably from his perspective, What was even worse was it was downright stupid. Tell me, what would lead a man with his kind of visibility to take the kind of chances that he took? To take his Lincoln Continental with his license plate and go touring in the parts of town he went in and to check into motels. A man who was on television, his face is known everywhere. I ask you, is that stupid? Jimmy Swigert were back in the back row, he'd say, amen. Sin is one thing. Stupidity is another. Oftentimes, we don't think. Now, why we don't think? Well, I will say this. The best defense I can offer you against stupidity is the Bible. I don't have much else to give you than that, but I do have that. I would say that a man who goes to his knees every day in prayer before God and takes the book of Psalms with him and goes through the book of Psalms one psalm at a time in prayer before God is less likely to do something really stupid than a man who doesn't. I would say a man who puts his feet up on a Sabbath morning with a cup of coffee in one hand and a Bible in the other and pages his way slowly through the book of Proverbs, putting his head back every once in a while to think. And then maybe after he's done that for a while, take a little nap and let those things soak into the subconscious for a while. A man who might read, or a woman who might read the book of Proverbs before bedtime at night and go to sleep pondering some of these things will be considerably less likely to do stupid things than someone who doesn't. And of course, in a sense, what you're doing is listening. We're back to listening again. You're listening to God when you do these things. Marriages fail because people provoke one another or allow themselves to be provoked. A lot of times we get provoked about things if we would just ignore it or laugh at it or be lighthearted about it, it would not cause any problem at all. And sometimes the person who is provoking you is only provoking you because they want attention. I don't know if you've ever considered that. I'll never forget the time when I was visiting a minister's home and he had a brand new newborn baby. Sweet little girl, I mean, just precious little thing. He also had a 3-year-old who was being ignored. And who, because she was being ignored, was beginning to be aggravating. And it was, here I am, I don't have any children, so I don't have anything to defend. I have no posture, no position, I don't have my blinders on about it. I'm ignorant about many things, but at least I haven't blinded myself to many things. And I sat there and watched, much like I watched my brothers-in-law in their conversations, as this man ignored his little 3-year-old, and you could almost see the wheels turning in her little head, where she concluded that the only way I'm going to get any attention out of my dad is to be an absolute nuisance. And then she goes ahead and does it, and she gets a spanking, and then she does it again. I came to the conclusion that little girl would rather be spanked than ignored. I don't understand it altogether. I haven't been able to get my mind around it, but I saw it. It was there, and there was no avoiding it. She would rather be spanked than ignored. Do you ever give a consideration to the fact that this person whom you love, who is aggravating the daylights out of you about this or that or the other thing, may be doing it because they're tired of being ignored? Because they want to be listened to? Because they want to be understood? Does that ever cross your mind? Well, it ought to. And rather than becoming provoked, maybe you ought to sit down and say, what is it? How can I help? What's the problem? What are you trying to say? I'm listening. You might be surprised at what you would hear and how easily some types of provocation can be resolved. Marriages also fail because people avenge themselves, because they get even, because they strike back. We oftentimes do hurt to other people. Sometimes we mean to do it, and sometimes we don't mean to do it. If a person who receives hurt turns the other cheek, refuses to retaliate, more often than not, it's over. Just finished. It's done. Now, I'm leaving on the side for the moment the question of serious abuse, because I think in some cases there are other factors at work here that are altogether different, where people are actually sick. In cases like that, professional help is called for as soon as possible. I'm just talking about your ordinary garden variety aggravations and hurts that we give one another in marriage all the time. that if people could turn the other cheek. That's funny, you know, we read in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says we are to turn the other cheek. And we know that you're supposed to do this, and I've had people ask me, well, supposing I'm walking along the street with my wife and some man comes up there and he hits me, or he's going to try to hurt my wife or something, what should I do? The Bible says I should turn the other cheek. My reply to him is, well, we could talk about that somewhere downstream if you could learn to turn the other cheek at home. You know, when your wife does something to you or hurts you, if you could learn to turn the other cheek at home and not retaliate with your wife, you've really got that lesson down pat, maybe then we could talk about this other way. I think too often we use these far-out examples of, well, supposing someone did this awful thing to me or my wife, supposing this took place. We use these things to keep from having to face up to the small things, the things that are real, the things that we really do have to face. You can live the rest of your life without having somebody walk up to you and hit you in the face. But you will not live the rest of your life if you're married without it happening to you in a figurative sense in your marriage. My question is, why talk about turning the other cheek in a fight when you haven't even learned to turn the other cheek in a little altercation, verbal altercation at home with the family, at the root level, the basis, right down at grassroots as to what people are supposed to do? Marriages fail because people hurt one another. Sometimes they hurt one another on purposes. They don't fail really because people unintentionally hurt one another. There's a simple way out of an unintentional hurt is to say, sweetheart, I'm sorry. I am sorry. I didn't mean it. Well, of course, lots of times what you get back is that, well, yeah, you did mean it too. Say, well, if I did mean it, I'm sorry for that too. The words, I'm sorry, should carry a lot of weight. One of the problems we have, though, is the next reason why marriages fail, because people won't forgive one another. And it's true. We have an awful time forgiving. Now, let me ask you this. Your husband hurts your feelings, and you get sort of mad about it and sullen up about it, and he says, look, dear, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. And you say, well, okay, that's all, I'll forgive you. And then you don't speak to him for the rest of the evening. Did you forgive him? Well, we could argue about that till the cows come home, I suppose. But the fact of the matter is that in whatever extent that you are still trying to inflict punishment, still trying to send a message, still trying to job or stick or make the other person uncomfortable, you have not forgiven them. You haven't let it go. And it's something that you have got to learn to do. It's why marriages fail, because people won't forgive. Marriages fail because people have to be right, no matter what the cost. And they have to be seen to be right. And so we wind up defending our position, defending our attitude, oftentimes even when we are wrong, because we just have to be right, instead of letting go of it. Marriages fail, and here comes one of the most fundamental, the most basic, and the most critical things for you to think about. Marriages fail because people don't keep their word. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you came to me and asked me to marry you, and I dig out my faithful Mary and Sam's marriage ceremony, I'm going to have you stand before me, and I'm going to have you faithfully promise before God, in the presence of these witnesses, to do certain things. Right? I wonder how many of you know and remember what you promised when you got married. You can actually sit down and write out the vows. You know what a vow is? A vow is a promise made in the presence of God. A vow before God in the presence of witnesses. You gave your word. You gave your word to love this person. You gave your word to protect this person. You gave this your word to, all the things that we're going to do, to cherish, to honor, and so forth. We break our word. And when you begin reading through the Bible, it's so often people get hung up on these things about that as though the only thing that God seems to really be upset about in relation to divorce and remarriage is that a person who is supposed to be having sex with this person has sex with this person. And it's that sex, somehow or other, that is the thing that God has gotten so furious about. Intimacy, physical intimacy, where people express love and affection for one another is not an evil thing. The thing that God gets furious with mankind about is breaking our word, not keeping our promises, not being faithful. My wife and I have made commitments to each other a long, long time ago. These commitments are life commitments. They were made till death do us part. When I was in the United States Naval Hospital in San Diego after surgery, lying up there with tubes coming out of my body in different places and feeling miserable and rotten, there was one person who I could depend on to come and see me, to take care of things, to look after things, to meet my request. There was one person I could depend on. That was my wife. When she was in hospital, and I think it was the Huntington Hospital, in Pasadena, California for thyroid surgery, and she was there still having difficulty with the effects of the anesthetic way on into the evening, there was one person she could depend on to be there, whatever happened. And it wasn't the nurse, and it wasn't the doctor, it was me. And I was there until she was conscious enough and felt good enough to tell me to go home and get some sleep. When I was in the hospital again, in Tyler, because of cardiac irregularities, the person who went with me to the hospital, who drove me there, the person who stayed with me, the person who came back and saw to it that things were taken care of, was my wife. We have always been and always will be there for each other. And this is what marriage is about. I have a great blessing. My wife is my best friend. Not everybody has that blessing. But I will tell you this. That commitment that you made whenever you made it, those promises that you made whenever you made them, God Almighty in heaven holds you to that promise. And marriages fail because people treat their word as something they can toss away. Now, you can talk to me until the cows come home about exceptions, if you wish. And I will grant you that there are exceptions. I will grant you that you bring a woman to me whose husband has beat her up and bruised her, and we'll talk about the exceptions and how this woman ought to proceed at this point. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you and what you ought to be doing. And it's too often the case, as Jesus was explaining to Peter what was going to happen to him, he had to turn around and say, "Well, Lord, what's going to happen to this disciple over here?" He said, "What's that to you?" And I think that rather than looking around for exceptions, because one of the reasons we look for exceptions is to find a loophole for ourselves in doing the things that we are supposed to do to make a marriage work. Marriages fail because people are unfaithful. Now, the problem with marriage, when it comes right down to it, is a spiritual problem. We can talk from time, till the cows come home about all the psychology and all of the pop psychology that is practiced nowadays about marriage and self-esteem and all the good things that go along. But the truth of the matter is, the problem with marriage, and if you have a problem with your marriage now or in the future, it will be a spiritual problem. And it will not be a question that you can resolve readily just by going to Ephesians 5, as beautiful as that is, or 1 Peter 3, as beautiful as that is. Let me take you to a different place. Turn back to Galatians, the 5th chapter. Galatians chapter 5, and let's get in perspective what is required of us when it comes to marriage. In Galatians, the 5th chapter, it says in verse 22, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering." Do you know what that word means? It means you suffer long. It means you put up with one another. It means that even though this person is hurting your feelings, you just say, "Well, I've got to stick with it." It means I've got to be patient. It means I've got to carry on. It means I've got to suffer, if need be, a long time. Long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. Do you have any idea what the difference the fruits of the Spirit would make in a marriage? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering. But you see, these are the changes that get wrought in a person's life by the presence of the Holy Spirit. And so this is what I mean when I say that the problem with marriage is a spiritual problem. And it's just as much a spiritual problem for someone who's not a Christian as it is for someone who is. Because the same laws having to do with the way people love one another are present there as well. That love and joy, and joy means happiness and cheerfulness, being up about things. Of course, anybody should understand what these other things mean in marriage. The fruits of the Spirit that make a difference more, I think, than many of us would ever be able to comprehend. In 2 Peter, earlier I took you to 1 Peter, this time 2 Peter, the first chapter. I have a little problem with my pages blowing, but that's all right, I'll still make it. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4. Whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these you might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. And beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, to temperance patience, to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness charity, agape, love. You know, a person who claims to be a Christian is supposed to be systematically adding these things to your life. And you know, it's a funny thing. I actually believe that in many cases we sort of have a marriage over here, and we have Christian living over here. And it's as though there's a set of scriptures that pertain to marriage that we apply to marriage, and these Christian living principles apply to Christian living. And I don't think anybody thinks about it this way, but it is as though we've got immunity from these Christian principles when we go home. I mean, I got to be nice to you, but I don't have to be nice to my wife. I got to be kind and virtuous in my dealings with you, but I don't have to be kind and virtuous in my dealings with her. You realize that what marriages need is a simple dose of basic Christianity. Basic Christianity. Basic Sermon on the Mount. Basis, chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. Love is. Love is not. Love never vaunts itself. Love is kind. Love is forgiving. You know, love is patient. It's all these things that we see them as spiritual principles. I'm supposed to be like that. And I don't know why it is and why it is so hard to get these same principles shifted over into your marriage. You know, my wife has learned in the business she is in how important it is to make a good impression and to have the goodwill of her fellow real estate agents. And has learned that you're how to treat people over the phone and how to talk to people over the phone and how to be gracious to people over the phone. Wouldn't it be awful if she were nice to them and rude to me? She's not. But do you know, people do. People do that. That oftentimes we will be far nicer to people we hardly know than we are to people we are supposed to love and that we promised to love. I don't know how you think God feels about that, but I think I know. If you turn back to Colossians, the 3rd chapter, for a little bit of a final explanation of what is meant, how the marriage relationship can be approached. Colossians chapter 3, and I think I'll begin in verse 8. But now I want you to put off. He's actually saying it's like clothing that you can put on or take off. And I want you to take off these particular garments. Take off anger and wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth. And allow me to pause for just a moment and tell you something. In our world and the kind of lives we live and the circumstances and the people we're around a lot of time, we sometimes pick up words for our vocabulary that we would really be better off without. Now, my vocabulary, I was 4 years in the Navy, is probably just about as good as anyone's as far as those types of things. I know what to say when I slam my thumb with a hammer. I'm no shrinking violet. I have been exposed to these things. And here we see a thing about don't let this kind of filthy communication or bad language come out of your mouth. And it's a habit that we have picked up many times in the world that we really ought to get rid of. But there's one thing that you must do. You must do. You must never allow profanity to enter into your marriage. And if it is there, you and your husband or wife need to agree to get it out. Because one of the things that causes the escalation of marital arguments and problems, and one of the reasons why marriages fail, is because when people get started, they escalate it by beginning to call one another names. And it's one thing to call your husband or your wife a hypocrite. That's very bad. But when you start putting pejorative adjectives in front of it, when you start calling them foul names, all of a sudden the stakes go up dramatically. And retaliation is invited in kind. And things can get out of hand very fast. 1, get profanity out of your marriage. Get it out of your life if you can. But get it out of your marriage. The two of you together ought to be able to do that. Second, get any name calling out of family arguments. No, your husband or your wife is not a hypocrite. If they are a hypocrite, you have no business calling them a hypocrite. That's not the way to do it. Name calling is one of the things that immediately precedes the escalation of marital problems into a final failure of marriage and a trip to the divorce court and the two people coming to hate each other like no other person on the face of God's green earth. Get it out. Don't lie to one another. If there's one person on the face of this green earth you cannot afford to lie to, it is your husband or your wife. Truth at home has got to be the foundation of a marriage. And it's something for you to work out for yourself, how you go about doing that. And if there have been things that if you told your wife or your husband would cause incalculable hurt, maybe you shouldn't. But it's one thing not to tell them certain things. It's another thing entirely to lie. This scripture doesn't seem to be talking about marriage, does it? You know we're not supposed to lie. But it's more important at home than it is anywhere. Don't do this, seeing you have put off the old man with his deeds. And you put on the new man, which is renewed in knowledge after the image of him that created him. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision nor uncircumcision, barbarian, Scythian, bond or free, but Christ is all and in all. Put on. Now, do you put on fresh, clean clothes over old, dirty clothes? Of course not. You take off the old, dirty clothes and then you put on the clean clothes. This is what he's saying. Put off these things so that you can put on these. Bowels of mercy. Kindness. Just like Christ forgave you, you forgive one another. Now, should I tell you less? And you see what I mean when I said earlier, there are things we must do before we can even start talking about Ephesians 5? We've got a lot of stuff to talk about in marriage. It has to do with basic, fundamental Christianity and taking that basic Christianity into the home first. If you can't do it there, it isn't going to do you much good to do it someplace else. Put on these things. Let the peace of God rule in your heart, to the which you are called in one body, and be you thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your heart. And whatever you do in word or in deed, do everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father by him. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as is fit in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and be not bitter against them. So maybe these things do have a bit more to marriage than what we might otherwise have thought. Maybe you've got a little better idea now of why marriages fail and of what your marriage needs. But if I can give it to you in a word, just one simple word, what marriages need, what your marriage needs, is love.